LCC's 2020 Digital LGBT+ Global Business Summit. My name is Lori Benson from EY's Inclusive and Sustainable Procurement Team. EY is a proud sponsor of the summit and of this next session. We drive the supplier diversity process globally for EY, and our purpose is to foster an inclusive and sustainable mindset that yields innovative solutions and economic impact for EY and the communities we serve. To further connect these values, I take actions using my platform to deliver EY's purpose of building a better working world. These are difficult times, and events are affecting us all. No one deserves to live in fear because of who they choose to love. It is not always easy to know the right thing to say, though I do know if I pause and listen, I can learn how to be part of the solution. The speaker I'm introducing this morning is an expert in helping others to be empathetic and take action. He spent some time with EY recently to help our people learn about the often unseen transgender and non-binary employees. At EY, inclusion will always be our greatest strength, and there is always more we can do. Working together, we make major progress towards inclusion for all. It is now my pleasure to introduce this morning's session, Gender Diversity in the Workplace, What Do I Need to Know to Get Started?, presented by Kai Scott, President, Transfocus Consulting, Inc. Thank you and enjoy the session.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here with you today. My name is Kai Scott, as Lori said, and I'm with Transfocus Consulting. I'm coming to you from rainy Vancouver, as you may see from the background, and it's also the unceded territory of the Squamish, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh. And so I very much come as a white settler within this context, and so I wanted to kind of start off with a land acknowledgement. Also to say that where specifically I'm calling from in Vancouver is called Ilyushen, which means good footing. And so that's the place name for this place that I'm in. And that's a really good, I think, kind of catchphrase for what I want to try to help today is to provide a good footing for gender diversity. So in terms of what I'm hoping to cover today, well, first of all, myself, a little bit more about myself. I use the pronouns he, him. And I'm a social scientist by trade, and I collect, information, do multi-stakeholder consultations, and help with complex social issues across a vast variety of different contexts. In particular, most recently, gender diversity, but in the past have done social impact assessments for mining developments. In terms of my lived experience, I come to you as someone who has trans experience. In particular, I'm a trans man. So that means I was assigned female at birth and I identify as a man. And later on in this session, we'll provide a lot more terms and concepts so that hopefully it'll allow you to get situated. But I wanted to position myself as part of this larger tapestry of gendered experiences. And certainly, of course, I'm just one person and I'm connected to a wider community that I've listened to and heard over the years. But certainly I don't have all the answers, as you can imagine. In terms of what I'm hoping we can cover today, we've got an icebreaker to kick us off, just to get us settled into the concept of gender identity. Then we'll go through some terms and concepts. Again, at a fairly high level, we won't be able to go through all the nitty and gritty today, but certainly it'll get you started on the right path. Then there's some background and context that you may or may not be aware of, just to help you get situated in terms of, in particular legal changes, as well as, what are some of the structural issues that trans folks face. Then we'll spend some time on what it means to be respectfully interacting with a trans person. That will hopefully allow you a little bit more confidence as you go forward and, go forward into this topic. And then, of course, we'll wrap up. There'll be a lot of time hope to provide a lot of time at the end for questions and answers so that you can really get into the meat of the matter. So just so you know, there's a Q&A section, which you may already be familiar with from yesterday's sessions. But certainly I invite you to submit questions all the way along. We will do questions at the end, but it's great to get your questions in as they happen. So feel free to go into the Q&A section to submit those. I'll also be doing several polls for engagement throughout the webinar, sorry, not webinar, but the session. And because we don't have a lot of time together, I will go through those fairly briefly. So once you see them, if you do want to participate, please do so quickly. And those are anonymous, so I very much encourage you to be as candid as you feel comfortable. So that's a bit of the housekeeping. And to start us off right away, I'll get you to provide your input in terms of what's your level of knowledge about gender diversity? What are we kind of starting off with today for folks in terms of, kind of starting off your journey? Are you kind of somewhat knowledgeable, or are you very knowledgeable on this topic? So we'll give you a few more seconds to get situated in the voting process, or the kind of polling process, for those of you who would like to participate. All right, a few more seconds. And we'll end the polling there. Sorry for those who weren't able to get there, but I'm sure we'll get you on the next poll. So I'll share the results. I hope that you're able to see that. And of course, now I don't know if I can. Oh, I see it at the bottom here. So we have folks who, there's some folks who are just starting off their journey, and then there are some who are kind of in the mid-range and looking to take the next steps. So that's great. And then we have people who are very knowledgeable. So that's great. That helps me figure out how to present today to you. So continuing on, I wanted to acknowledge that we hear very often that people are very nervous about the topic of gender diversity. A lot of people are overwhelmed, they're concerned, they're anxious. And so you may be feeling any one of these on the screen here. And as we very commonly hear, people don't want to say the wrong thing or hurt anyone, which is very understandable and very compassionate. They want to be respectful. They feel overwhelmed because it feels like there's so much to learn. And so I hope by the end of this session, some of these things will have dissolved a bit for you. And if you feel any of these, you're absolutely in the right place. This is a safe space for you to ask the questions that are kind of foremost on your mind, and to really get into this topic and sink into it. So I encourage you to be courageous in terms of leaning into this topic, even if it feels uncomfortable. But we're all in it together, and we're going to learn well together. So, as I promised, there is an icebreaker. And usually when we have live sessions or more interactive sessions, we talk this one through. But given that we're in this setting, I thought I'd put it in a poll question instead. And so let me just pull that up, the poll question here. And basically, just want to know, what's your earliest memory or recall of knowing your own gender identity? And so this might be a bit of a jog down memory lane for some of you. And so to think through, was it your parents? Was it somewhere within a school context? Was it washrooms and change rooms? Was it toys that you played with? Oftentimes siblings are a first kind of point of reference for knowing one's gender identity. So yeah, we'll get you to kind of consider, and it's a select all that applies. So maybe it's a few of these things. And then for some of you, it may actually be a point of, I actually don't remember. There's a bit of a scratching of the head, and there's no one point in time that you can kind of reflect on that reminds you of how you might have known. So we'll give you a few more seconds to consider what that first touch point or set of touch points might have been in terms of knowing your own gender. Okay, a few more seconds, and then we'll end here, and we'll share the results. So hopefully you can see this, but we've got a handful of folks who said parents. So that's a very natural starting point. Oftentimes parents are informing in one way or another, maybe by different treatment or by the different clothes that they put on their children. Oftentimes siblings are a first touch point as well. Different bathroom usage, especially within the school context, can often kind of signal to people that there's a difference, and kids pick up on that pretty quickly. Teachers, again, and then the different clothing and different toys. And then there's a handful of you who also said, I can't remember, which is also a very common response to this icebreaker. So this is a really great exercise for us to start the conversation, mainly to kind of see where the different touch points are. And here we've listed only a few, but there's so many different points where gender is at play within our society. And this is oftentimes taught at a very early age. I mean, for some of you, you could have been remembering back to 3, 4, 5, 6 years old. So fairly early that you kind of pick up this understanding. And for those of you who can't remember, part of what that might be is that how you're read on the outside by others matches with how you feel on the inside. And so as a result, there's nothing to kind of figure out or to know or to recognize. And so as a result, there's just not as much to be aware of. And so that's part of what's at play. But important to note that we all have a gender identity and that we have varied experiences around that. And because oftentimes trans can be this bit of a mythical other that seems so kind of distant and removed. But when we reflect on our own gendered experiences, sometimes we can see that there were challenges that we faced that might have overlap with some of the trans experiences. So really important to situate our own gendered experience within this larger context. So carrying on, we've got some terms and concepts to let you know about. And really a great place to start is at birth. And so some of you might have either heard the question or even asked the question, if somebody is pregnant, is it a boy or a girl, right? And there's a lot of different concepts that are at play when we're talking about someone, when somebody is being born. And so we're going to tease apart some of those concepts, especially if someone is just being born. Really, there's two different concepts that are at play. There's sex assigned at birth, and then there's gender identity. And typically, those have been kind of conflated or collapsed together. But today, we're teasing those apart for a very important reason. Sex is all about one's assigned. It's usually assigned at birth. It's usually about anatomy, so sex characteristics, hormones, genes, and so forth. And usually a healthcare professional is involved. Typically, there's only female and male options. Of course, we do know that there are intersex folks that have that are kind of fill out that spectrum of sex at birth. And so it's not just female and male. There's actually a lot more range and diversity within our anatomy than we presently acknowledge within our medical systems. There's also gender identity, which is our felt sense, our internal sense of who we are in terms of our gender. There's a spectrum for that as well. So woman, man, there's also somewhere in between that or completely outside of that. There's also gender expression, which is kind of trending more outwards, the outward appearance that we have in terms of hairstyles, accessories, clothing, and a whole variety of mannerisms and personality traits are often labeled feminine, masculine, or androgynous. Again, that also exists along a spectrum. Last but not least, not necessarily about gender per se, but oftentimes people get gender identity and sexual orientation confused, especially if people are coming from the general public. They often see the LGBT or the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community as this cohesive whole and kind of see the issues as the same. But for sexual orientation, we're talking about someone who, the attractions that somebody has. It does involve gender in that where you're typically attracted to particular genders or one gender. And so that's where sometimes the confusion lies. But gender identity and sexual orientation are, in fact, separate matters and have different issues and needs related to them. And for all of these, it's really important to note that they exist along different continua, and they're not just one or the other of things, because oftentimes in society, we've been taught that there's just two of things. So man and woman, female and male, feminine and masculine, but there's actually much, much more than that. There's a spectrum of them. So there's also terms that you might be aware of or know about. So there's cisgender, which is anybody whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth. So I would say probably the majority of folks are cisgender. Typically, you want to combine that from a grammatical perspective with a noun, so cisgender people or cisgender woman, and so forth. But this is a useful term, especially when we're trying to make distinguish differences between cisgender and transgender. So we're not always using cisgender unless people want to self-identify themselves, but for the most part, it's useful because sometimes people have been grasping for words, and unfortunately to me, without any malice, said there's trans men and then there's real men. And so you can see that people are trying to indicate a difference, but they're using a word that unfortunately puts a judgment on trans folks, which they don't intend, but they're just not at the ready with words that are more helpful for the conversation. So trans men and cis men is a much better way of going about it. Transgender is somebody whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. So it's a very simple definition. Oftentimes people are surprised. They've heard from the media a lot of kind of somewhat of a misnomer for trans folks. Typically you might hear the media say, was a man is now a woman type of dialogue. And that might be true for some trans folks or resonate for them. But for the majority of trans folks, they felt their gender from very early on, and there's not actually a change in gender. There might be a change in their body or in their social roles or their names and so forth, but their gender identity remains the same. Of course, gender fluid folks are exempt or are separate matter from that, but for the most part, that's the case. There's also non-binary folks. So we have typically focused a lot, especially in the early days, on trans men and women, but there's actually much more beyond trans men and women. There's actually folks who don't identify as either men or women, either somewhere between or beyond that. And so putting that all together, there's this helpful visual that kind of gives you a sense of all these different umbrellas that have different terms kind of underneath them. So we've got the broad umbrella of transgender, and that is encompassing of folks whose gender is different from their sex assigned at birth. That includes trans men and women, as well as there's non-binary, which is again somewhat of an umbrella for a whole host of other gendered experiences. Some of them are listed here, pretty much just examples. There's many more. And this is where people are trying to explain and describe what their non-binary experience is. So it could be somebody who feels they don't have any gender at all. It could be somebody, so agender. It could be bigender, somebody holding two genders at once. Perhaps they're a woman and non-binary at the same time. There's also gender queer, which is generally a term for somebody who does not want to provide a category they don't want to be boxed in the way that maybe they felt at the early ages. And gender fluid is somebody who changes their gender over time. That time could be from day to day or maybe from year to year. The time is really based on the individual. There's also transition, which there's 3 types of transition that somebody could opt into. You don't have to do any sort of transition to be trans. That's common myth that you have to do something to change something to be trans, when really it's about the basic definition. There's social transition, there's medical transition, and there's legal transition. Social is all about changing name, appearance, and so forth. There's medical transition, which is the media's favorite because very sensational. And it could be a whole range of different gender-affirming surgeries, treatments, and so forth. There's not just one. I have had people say, have you had the surgery? Thinking that there's just one thing that you do and then you're done. That's not the case. There's actually a whole tapestry of different options. There's also legal change, which is documents. So passports, driver's license, medical care cards. There's actually a long list of things that need to be changed and often fairly prohibitively expensive for some folks. So it's important to keep that in mind. And not everybody is going through it in a linear fashion. It's really based on the individual in terms of what they need, what they want, and where they're at. So it could very well be none of these options or a tapestry or a selection of them. So very much letting people choose what they need and not having that requirement. So we've got another question, and we'll just see in terms of if you have a recall of the definition for transgender, and there's several different options for that. There's someone who was born in the wrong body, a man who used to be a woman, or vice versa. And the last one is someone whose gender does not align with their sex assigned at birth. So what is the definition of transgender? I'll give you a few more seconds there. Okay, one more second here just to, and then we'll share the results. And so you can see that most of you selected someone whose gender does not align with their sex assigned at birth. And I see that there are a few that selected someone who was born in the wrong body. And certainly that does resonate for some trans folks, so it's not necessarily in any way wrong. But for the most part, some folks don't feel that way. And so a more descriptive way of talking about transgender in terms of gender not aligning with sex assigned at birth is, a more all-encompassing description of people's experiences. Great. So continuing on. So we have a bit more background and context to let you know some of the changes that have happened well, not so much recently anymore. You can see some of the human rights codes, both on a provincial level as well as on the federal level, have changed. And I keep saying recently, but now I do the math and it's been 3 years, right? So it's good to update that. And so provincially in Canada, Ontario was the first province to add gender identity and expression to their human rights code. And then other provinces followed suit. And you can appreciate now, knowing all the different dimensions, that before it was just sex. And so that wasn't all encompassing enough for trans folks for full protection. And so it's an important addition to the codes and act for that better understanding and full protection. Before that, we did have case law that supported someone to access the washrooms that align with their gender identity. So we actually already had certain things clarified, which is a little bit different than what's happening down in the United States. There's also been administrative changes. So now you can see the provinces in turquoise have added X to their driver's licenses as an option for gender marker. And this is really important, especially for non-binary folks who didn't have an option to select before. And so trans men and women will still continue to select M and F, but for non-binary folks, this is a really important step forward. And it's also on passports. But you don't see a huge lineup of non-binary folks, mainly because there's not a lot of clarification on how that will be received in other countries. There's also structural issues that trans folk face. In particular, at Transfocus, we do a lot of important work on these structural issues in terms of changing systems, practices, and spaces to be better welcoming and inclusive of trans and non-binary folks. Here are some examples. There's kind of 5 areas where trans folks face issues. And of course, we won't have time to go through in those in detail, but there's a lot more substance behind these that do require quite a bit of attention and in some instances fairly big reworking within organizations to be better welcoming. There's gender data. So oftentimes forms and surveys don't have enough gender response options to be fully encompassing of gendered experiences. There's records. So oftentimes, because legal name change and gender change are very difficult, oftentimes you have people who have a mixture of different documents or names on their documents. So they'll have a legal name that's different than their preferred name. And certainly also not having enough options for the titles, Mr. and Ms., and so forth. There's also marketing and communications. Oftentimes our communications are very binary in nature. And some of that will go through in the next few slides, but it's really looking at both our written and our visuals to see if we're representing only 2 of each within how we go about that. Programs and services, sometimes there's single gender programs or services that make sense, but it's often not clear who among trans folks is welcome within that. If you think about a women in leadership program, oftentimes trans women don't know if they'll be supported and welcome within those spaces. So there's a little bit of legwork there to do to make that clear. There's also washrooms and change rooms, which is the media's favorite. So do you have enough options beyond men's and women's facilities? And there's also privacy issues within men's and women's facilities. And what does it take to be an inclusive organization? Now, I will note this is a GIF that I don't think is possible within the context of this slide. So there usually is another piece that drops. So there's the supportive structures, and then there's also the supportive cultures. And both work together and fit together, but both require their own separate effort as well. And so really being thoughtful and considerate around that. Today we'll talk a little bit about supportive culture, but I wanted to make sure that we're not missing the supportive structures, because oftentimes you can prepare your staff to be the most wonderful and welcoming, but then if you pivot to a form that only has male and female on it, it kind of falls flat, right? So you want to have those both working together to make it the most inclusive experience and for everyone. So supportive culture, I'll go through some kind of high-level key pieces to keep in mind when interacting with a trans person. This is by no means exhaustive, but it'll hopefully help to get the ball rolling. And the first thing that I have is a bit of a poll question. And before I get started on this poll question, I do invite you to give your questions as you have them. And so let's see. Okay, here we go. So if a trans person were to start working with your team tomorrow, what do you think you would need to know about them? And it's a select all that apply. And some of the response options are, do you think you would need to know their name, what washroom they use, their pronouns, their dating life, their name at birth, medical procedures, their gender identity, or family issues. So I'll just give you a few seconds to think about what you might need to know about somebody that you're just getting to start to know. Give you a few more seconds to weigh in. There's a few options there. Okay, I'm going to end the voting here and share the results. So you'll see that most of you selected two things, name and pronouns. And then a few of you indicated washroom usage, some medical procedures and gender identity, and some family issues. And so in the next slide, I'll go through some of the responses to consider when you're thinking about that, and explain why some of you might have had the inclination to ask for additional detail, but how those are actually end up being private pieces of information. So need to know, name and pronoun is actually all you need to get started. Helpful to know is what somebody might need to feel supported. Sometimes they need support, sometimes they don't. And then everything else is personal. And I just wanted to go through a few of the ones. Some of them are obvious, and then others might not be as obvious. So some of you did select gender identity, which is an understandable starting point. However, oftentimes when we want gender identity, we actually are wanting pronouns. And so sometimes we do this kind of indirect pathway to pronouns through gender identity. And what I'll be sharing next is actually you don't need gender identity at all. And sometimes people may share that as they go along, so that's fine as well. Sometimes people think they want to be helpful and know somebody's washroom usage so they can traffic control folks into the right washroom. And that's also an understandable inclination. However, what I encourage people to do is just offer all the options to everybody, regardless if somebody is trans, just so that everybody knows where is what, and then they can self-select the ones that right. And the main reason for that is that actually folks who are cisgender are often more times than not wanting single occupancy washrooms. We're doing a lot of research, and about a quarter to 30% of cisgender people actually want single occupancy. So if we're traffic controlling people into men's or women's, we're actually not offering them all the options. So it's actually a benefit for everybody. In terms of privacy, it's really important to note that trans status and birth name, if you know those are very much private pieces of information, and to keep those to yourself unless you've had a conversation with a trans individual, in particular if they're early transition, then checking in with them, and if they've agreed, then only share the pieces that you've talked about. And if not, then you kind of can head that off and say, it's not my story to tell, or you should ask that trans person directly. Because oftentimes trans can be a bit of a salacious detail that can be passed on unwittingly, and we want to avoid those kinds of things, those whisper campaigns that sometimes happen to trans folks. There's also pronouns, which I was talking about in reference to gender identity, and that's how we refer to one another in the third person. So he, she are very common ones. Oftentimes they is something a bit new for some folks, but that is a gender neutral, a very common gender neutral option for folks, for a whole variety of folks, but in particular non-binary folks who don't feel comfortable or don't feel she or he are a right option for them. And so these are some of the examples. These are only a few. There's many more. For example, Z and Zer are also a gender neutral option. And so people are coming up with different ways of doing that. Just because, and another thing in terms of misgendering is anytime we use the incorrect pronoun for someone, oftentimes what's happening is we're guessing what somebody's pronouns are based on how they look. So you'll see here we've got these different lines or spectra. So we've got gender expression, sex assigned at birth in terms of their body shape. We might be kind of looking at their body shape, looking how they're dressed or expressing themselves, and then making like kind of reverse engineering, making assumptions about their gender identity. And then on top of that, we then assume what their pronouns are. So we're doing this two-step process kind of automatically, kind of how we're by habit almost. And unfortunately, people, especially trans folks, get misgendered. Of course, it's not just trans folks. There's many cisgender folks who also get misgendered in this way. And there's also folks who are androgynous appearing, and they unfortunately get the question of, are you a man or a woman? Are you a boy or girl? And oftentimes, really, when people are asking that, they're really just wanting somebody's pronoun. So really about what this is about is kind of pausing those assumptions that we have that we do on a fairly regular basis, and getting that information directly from the person, whether they be trans or not, right? And so some of this does take practice because it's so ingrained for us to do it. But I thought it'd be really important to see kind of frame by frame what's happening when we're misgendering somebody. And how do we, so if we don't do it based on assumptions or looking at someone, what do we do instead? And there's several different ways to get pronouns. You can ask directly, just what are your pronouns? Usually I do this if I'm not going to see this person again and it's important for the interaction to get it quickly. And I'd say, I don't want to make any assumptions. I just want, what are your pronouns? If I have more time, I'll model it. I'll say, my name is Kai. I use he, him pronouns, and then, shake hands or whatever is now appropriate, the elbow bump. And in that way, I've modeled it. And then either the person on the other end knows what's going on and says, my name's Pat. I use they, them pronouns. Or they'll say, why'd you give me your pronouns? That's weird. And then you'll have a moment of saying, I don't assume people's pronouns. And instead, I offer space for people to provide it to me. People are like, oh, I never thought about it. So it's a kind of a teachable moment. And I've certainly done this in the mining industry, which is a lot of fun. So I invite you to do it in your various industries, even if it feels awkward at first. If you do it enough times, it normalizes it in ways that become kind of more comfortable. And the other one is wait and listen. So you're oftentimes with a person, they're either people around them that know them well will use pronouns in reference to them, or they'll speak to themselves about themselves in a gendered way. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, what kind of guy do I think I am, right? And then you've got gendered information about me by virtue of how I've talked about myself. There will be mistakes along the way. And when that happens, it's really important to do a quick acknowledgement. My bad, I meant she, and then carry on. Oftentimes people feel very guilty and self-conscious and may belabor a mistake well beyond what's needed. And certainly doing this on one-on-one is really important, but also within a group to model how to recover from mistakes. You might also see someone making mistakes, and in that case, providing a gentle reminder and offering support is really important. But you might also want to strategize with the trans person about when misgendering from someone else happens in a group context, whether the trans person wants you to jump in to help out or to hang back. Sometimes trans people want help. They're like, yeah, I'm tired of kind of reminding people. Can you help and jump in? And in which case, you'll provide that and help out. There's also beyond pronouns, gender inclusive language. Oftentimes we very much are saying ladies and gentlemen as an example of something that's binary only, so only men and only women, but there's actually much more beyond that for non-binary folks. And so an alternative is good afternoon, esteemed guests, as an example. There's many more. I'll skip past this poll because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So if you have a question, feel free to submit it to the Q&A so that we, in a few more slides, we'll start to pivot to that. Some examples of gender inclusive language. So on our left, you'll see the binary only terms, and then on the right, the gender neutral terms. And so there's a lot of different examples here, but there's many more beyond this. Men and women, we often reference that only. Husbands and wife, if we're thinking about family relations. My favorite, which you might have seen here, is niece and nephew, so nibbling, kind of the counterpart to sibling. And so these are really important to have at the ready, especially if we're talking to an audience or to a group of people that we don't know their genders, and so we don't want to assume that there's just men and women. And so we're offering these kind of more expansive terms for that kind of encompass everybody. So we've got a few more kind of concluding thoughts, and I have some additional resources. So it's about following the lead of the trans person, checking in with them, and respecting their name and pronoun, which may take some practice to get to a better understanding, and practicing gender inclusive language. Again, that also might be, because we've said ladies and gentlemen so many times, you might be going down that pathway and maybe add non-binary to the end. So ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary people, just as you're starting to kind of get used to this kind of new way of talking. And as with anything, there is some effort that needs to be applied. So it's an ongoing practice rather than, now you've had this presentation and suddenly everything's going to be, different. So I very much encourage you to reach out to additional resources. Of course, TransFocus is very happy to partner with you on that. There's also YouTube videos created by trans people about their journeys. There's TV shows. For example, Pose is this fantastic show about trans women of color that tells their stories in depth and nuance. There's also podcasts where people are talking about, trans people are talking about their own issues. And of course, articles and participating in specific events for trans folks, which is Trans Day of Remembrance in November and Trans Day of Visibility in March. So there's a lot there that you can continue your journey on. And so the last survey question before I go over to the questions is the following. Where do you feel like your knowledge is at now that we've gone through a bit of some kind of knowledge and terms and concepts? And then I will also see what kind of questions have come in. Okay, I'll give you a few more seconds here. So, do you feel somewhat knowledgeable, very knowledgeable? And okay, so we'll end the polling here. And I'll share the results. And it looks like there's been a bit of a shift, which is fantastic. And I'm glad to hear that as well. And of course, we can continue to extend our learning past this type of session. Of course, we've only touched the surface, and there's a lot more, but hopefully that gets you inspired to continue that learning process. So I have 5 minutes left for questions, and don't show question list. Let's see that. Okay. So we've got 2 questions here. So we've got the first question is, so if cisgender is related to the gender identity, can someone be gay, sexual orientation, but also cisgender? Fantastic question. Yes, that's actually exactly correct. So sexual orientation is about who one is attracted to. Gender is involved because it's usually based on gender, what our attraction is. But then cisgender is about our own personal experience around gender. So for some folks, they feel the gender that the sex that they were assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity. So for example, somebody might be a cisgender man. So that's somebody who was male assigned at birth that identifies as a man. And then as they grow up, they may have a better understanding of their sexual orientation to be one that is gay. And then so that person would be attracted to other men. That might be other cisgender men. It might be other transgender men. But it's generally they're attracted to other men. That's an example of how the flow goes from one's own understanding of gender to then how one is attracted to other people. And so hopefully that flow makes a little bit more sense, but that's definitely, they are separate, but of course kind of related a bit in terms of gender. The next question is, it's a bit telling that any gender diverse or non-people depicted on TV seem to always be assistants. Is there any new data or stats about a glass ceiling or career limitations for trans and non-binary people? Yeah, so that's a very good point in terms of, there's a few things there to unpack. One, that there are a lot of challenges that trans folks face. Media is a very good example of that in terms of, unfortunately, we haven't quite gotten far enough where there's a lead role for somebody that really fills out their life in a nuanced way. And then there's also that trans folks face the issues that they face within, say, a workplace context, where they're often having to clear pathways where they, hit up against the wall, and then have to go and ask for help to say, hey, can we remove this blockage and expand things or relax things or whatnot. So, and of course, anytime you're distracted with that, of course, you're not being, fully paying attention to work or being able to fully immerse yourself in that. So it's really important to remove those things for trans folks within a workplace context. The last thing I'll say about data is that oftentimes we're not, especially within organizations, collecting data in a refined enough manner to actually know what's going on for trans and non-binary folks. So that's a huge miss for organizations to know exactly what the issues are that they can further unpack and help folks with. So that gender data collection piece is actually really critical to know exactly what's going on for one's employees and also customers as well, I would say. And we are knowing on a broader level, we are getting better data. We actually don't collect gender data in an expanded form within the census yet. 2021, we will start to collect it in an expanded form, which is good. For now, we have TransPulse Canada data, which is really key, and they're now just releasing those data from a survey done last summer. So Canadian national level data will start to get a better picture of what's going on for trans folks. But of course, I think it's really important to have all the levels. So the national level, Canadian government data, the TransPulse nationwide data, and then the company level data as well. So we've got a few more questions. I'll probably just be able to take one more. So we have, as a writer, pronouns have grammatically been singular or plural. Over the decades, writers have referenced he or she for singular. I have a challenge with the grammar using they, their as a singular pronoun. Any employer assistance that you can provide for grammar issues has been sent for moderation. Yeah, so we didn't have enough time to go into all the detail and nuance of they, them pronouns. Certainly, a lot of dictionaries are starting to now shift towards recognizing that as a singular use, so they, them. And, the grammar lesson around that is, when you're using they, the pronoun, even just for one person, it's they are, but when you're using the person's name, it's say aftan is, right? So that's a bit tricky for the mind to wrap its head around. But certainly for like a gender neutral, all-encompassing, that's also a use of they, them for if we're talking about a group whose genders we don't know, and may also include non-binary folks. So a lot of agreements and contracts have he, she language, which some non-binary folks that I know are like, well, that contract doesn't apply to me. So there's actually a need to update that language to be all-encompassing for use of they, them. And some of it is just about practice. We actually already use it for in regular day-to-day use, but may not recognize it. So if somebody leaves a cell phone, we often say, well, I wonder if they'll come back and get it, or we should make sure they get it, right? So we're already using it, just not recognizing it in the ways that we need to apply it within a more general context. Unfortunately, I've run out of time to go further and deeper into that, but great questions, and thank you so much for your engagement. I really enjoyed our session and our time together, and of course, I look forward to hearing how your journeys unfold on gender diversity, and I hope you have a good rest of the summit and enjoy the rest of the sessions. So thank you so much.